Good evening. On behalf of JP Updates, our host, my name is Chasko Bennett. I've been asked to be the moderator for tonight's dialogue session, a wonderful forum which gives us the opportunity to hear from senior policymakers, government officials, former government officials, activists, together in a room. I look around and I see a wonderful group of people, leaders in their field, journalism, community, really special people, great group of great audience, and we have a wonderful, wonderful event here for tonight. But before we get to our event, it is my pleasure to ask Mr. Joe Gross, our representative of JP Updates, to tell you a little bit about JP Updates and why we are here tonight. Joe.
Thank you so much, Chasko, for the introduction. Thank you so much for the Friedlander Group for putting this together. And thank you very much for JP Updates for putting a forum out discussing religious rights and civil rights. And we have tonight Mr. Sanford Rubenstein, Deborah Laufer, but more importantly, we have Governor David Paterson, which has been very outspoken about religious rights. And if we go back 7 years in West Hempstead, the governor stood up in front of 800 congregants. And the issue was the Erev that they wanted to erect in West Hempstead. And the governor said the following: I'm hoping we can bring tolerance and understanding to the desire of those who want to erect the Erev right here in the Hamptons. And the governor made a plea for all parties to get together and try to see how we can work this out. When it comes to civil rights, the governor is the one that took the minority and women business owners that were only getting 4% in New York State from the contracts that the state was issuing and pushed it up to 24%. And I'm happy to report that today, New York State is over 25%, in many cases hitting the 30% mark, and it all is because of Governor Paterson's signing of bills that pushed the minority and women business owner to succeed and give them a chance with government contracts. So this is the perfect forum, and let's give them a round of applause, because we all know in the Orthodox community, it's very hard to make a living and afford the lifestyle with the kosher food that we have to buy and the education without having, in most homes, both spouses working. And a lot of the women in the household have undertaken the entrepreneurship role and went out and opened up businesses to be able to support the family. And now they have an opportunity to get some of those contracts in New York State, and the city is working towards that goal as well. They're not there yet, but hopefully, because of what the state did, they're now looking at doing similar numbers to what the state does. So that is a help for us in the Orthodox community and a help across the state of New York. And that's the forum we're going to have tonight, discussing religious freedom and rights and civil rights. And we have the right people in the room to give us the best possible result that we're looking for. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Setting up the conversation right now. The organizers asked me to give you a little bit of a background of how this event came to fruition, came to be here tonight. We look around, we're living in a world where we hear about civil rights. We hear about justice. We see marches, we see protests. In fact, democracy encourages the world to speak up, speak out. Where did it all begin? Where did it all come from? So we've been the beneficiaries, this generation, my generation, of those who've come before us, both in the Jewish community and, yes, in the African American community. From Selma to Sabbath, some might not think there's a correlation, but for many of us in this room, certainly those older than me, they know that they are absolutely intertwined. Who and what is Selma? Governor Patterson doesn't need me to give him a background on Selma. I'm sure Attorney Sanford Rubenstein doesn't need me, a Jewish kid from Queens, to tell anybody here about Selma. Our wonderful guest representing the Anti-Defamation League certainly doesn't need me to give her a tutorial on Selma. But many of us in this room don't really know what happened in Selma. And I could go on and on. Let's understand, let's keep it very brief, and realize that the fight for justice in the African American community is a microcosm as a fight for justice for the American people. What the African American community has fought for and has won can be said for many communities, from Selma to Sabbath. Activists, religious leaders, people who cared, stood up, shouted, were willing to do anything and everything and put it all on the line to better their community, to find justice for their community. Are we any different? Don't we deserve justice for our community? Don't we want equal rights, fairness, equity for our community? Fairness and equity needs to be fairness for all and equity for all. And until America reaches that goal, the fight continues. Each community fights in their own way. Each community does in their own way. But if you peel back the veneer, you will see that the fight is the same. And for that, we owe our founding fathers of the United States of America a tremendous gratitude, because in this country, as opposed to where our ancestors came from, we could stand up and we could speak out. Yes, there were those who were beaten, there were those who were imprisoned, and yes, there were those who lost their lives. America just celebrated not that long ago the anniversary of the Pettus Bridge. Selma, what happened there? What happened there was a community of people who said, no more, enough. We demand our equal rights. And from that, from the legislation that came out of that era, of that time, other legislation was passed and other protections for other communities and other religions came out of that fight as well. Before the 60s, my grandfather would come home on Friday, every Friday, says my father, with a smile on his face. He would say, Baruch Hashem, which means thank God, I got fired again. And he did come home with a smile. For refusing to report to work the next day on Shabbos, the boss told him, don't come in on Monday. On my grandfather's tombstone, one of the things that the family wrote was that he kept the Sabbath. Is Selma so far away from Sabbath? A Holocaust survivor who lost it all, fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters, came to this great country and couldn't make it because he couldn't find respect for his religious rights. Is Selma so far away from Sabbath? We saw the tragic catastrophe that transpired in Charleston, a catastrophe, going into a historic church that was on the front lines of the civil rights movement and was targeted because it was on the front lines of the civil rights movement, and murder the best of the best, God-fearing people sitting and studying the Bible in the evening who had welcomed their shooter to their class. Are we so far away from Selma? Unfortunately, I'm not so sure. Or in Pine Bush, where the school district was just fined and lost $4.5 or something million because of discrimination against Jewish students. We're not talking about Hasidic yarmulke-wearing students. We're talking about kids who are Jewish and were being oppressed and were being brutalized with swastikas and bullying. because they're Jewish. Oh, we'll get to the discrimination against the Hasidic community later on this evening, I assure you. Make no mistake about it. There is ugly discrimination going on. Are we so far away from Selma? Enough from me. You've come to hear very wonderful and auspicious guests who have come to impart their experience with this great audience. And so I will begin the program by introducing someone who we just heard about. David Patterson. Wonderful career. Look up his Wikipedia file. It's pages and pages and pages long. Let's cut to the, I would say, the exciting part. A state senator who had risen to the rank of minority leader, whose conference was poised to take over the majority, and agreed instead to give up the potential of being the majority leader of the state senate to run as lieutenant governor together with Governor Spitzer. The critics were shocked. The pundits couldn't believe it. They laughed. Why is he doing it? Lieutenant governor? What's the lieutenant governor? David Patterson must have had prophetic vision for a man like himself. Governor Patterson became the governor, as we all know, at a time of great importance to the state. The state was in fiscal despair. We were in trouble, massive trouble. Governor Patterson captained the ship, reduced so much to make sure that the budget would be able to make it. And the story goes on and on. But for me personally, and I told the governor I'm going to embarrass him a little bit, my first opportunity as an activist to meet a sitting governor in Albany was at a time where there was tremendous fiscal problems in the state. And the state had made a decision that they were going to cut the budget for all schools. Leon remembers, he's shaking his head. And we sat in the governor's office together with the governor, who's sitting at the head of the table. And the state had proposed to cut the private school system 95% of the mandated services that they were receiving. And the public school, who was also going to receive some services and mandated services money, was only going to be receiving a 5% cut. And we made impassioned plea to the governor. And we said, Governor, we are all ready to share an equal burden. The state is in fiscal trouble. We are prepared to absorb the fiscal burden that is responsible. What, you cut the public schools? We accept that you cut the private schools. But it is not right, and it is not fair, it is not just, and it is not equitable to cut us 95% and cut the public schools only 5%. The governor hears this, looks over to his aide at that time, Larry Schwartz, and says the following: Larry, is this true? And Larry looks at him sheepishly and says, that's the proposal, yes. Well, we're going to have to do something about that. They're right. And in fact, indeed, to his great credit and my everlasting gratitude, the governor, in fact, made equal cuts that year of 5% for the public schools and for the private schools, and taught this young activist that standing up and speaking out can and will make a difference. It is my great honor and pleasure and privilege to welcome and introduce Governor David Patterson.
Well, thank you very much, all of you, and particularly to the Friedlander Group, and as a Friedlander, my friend, JP Updates, and the ADL for providing Deborah Alava here tonight, and for all of you who would come here to talk about probably the most important element toward bringing our city, our state, and our peoples all over the country together, because it's that kind of cooperation that we're going to need to solve a lot of problems that all of us are experiencing in terms of state budgets wildly out of balance, housing issues all over the city, the issue of education, and what are the proper forums to provide and also to measure the results of education, and crime, which is after recession on the rise again, and unemployment that has not reduced itself as we would like. These massive issues cannot in any way be obfuscated from our redress by continued internal problems from communities that all have the same goals and all, interestingly enough, picture our country the same way, but have a little problem cooperating with each other to get there. Now, 2 years before Selma, in 1963, there was a March on Washington. And I was scheduled to go to that March on Washington, and I went to bed early, and I was 9 years old, but I knew enough about what was going on that I knew the historic nature, and I knew that years later I could tell people I'd attended the March on Washington. I did not, because when I got up, my parents told me that there was potential danger, there were threats of violence, and it was agreed that my father, Basil Patterson, of blessed memory, we would attend the march and that my mother would stay home with me. I'm still annoyed at both of them to this day for that decision, but nonetheless, it gives you an idea of where life was in this country just 52 years ago. And it was proven 50 years ago on March the 6th of 1965, when the terrible attacks on the Edmund Pettus Bridge became the catalyst for the famous march from Selma to Montgomery. And that march, I think, shined the light of awareness and the light of exposure on an America that was treating nearly a tenth of its citizens in a completely dehumanized way. But it was encouraging to know that the Jewish community, which is a rather small community when compared to the rest of the country, was a big community of people who went to the South, who struggled and persevered in civil rights demonstrations, some losing their lives because so many members of the Jewish community did not forget where they came from. They did not forget various oppression, discrimination, violence, and anti-Semitic verbiage that had plagued and oppressed these neighborhoods for thousands of years all over the world. So when I was growing up, I think as a child watching some of these civil rights demonstrations, I was struck by the people who went outside of their backyards, outside of their neighborhoods, to a fight that involved others and wanted to be one of those people. It's easy to understand your own oppression. Your family receives it. The people in your neighborhood know all about it. And there's a camaraderie of struggle. But to walk across those lines into other communities and neighborhoods, and in some cases putting your own life on the line because you believed in a higher humanity, in one that could not judge people by the color of their skin or their ethnicity or their religion or their race. And it was that kind of service that we really celebrate when we have these conversations. We had a conversation before dinner about whether or not we should really be honoring them because they did what was right. But you see, when you're doing what's right, and too many people are doing what's wrong, and a majority of the people are doing nothing at all, standing by and watching, that's why we have to honor people, because to them, right was a verb. It wasn't what they believed, it was what they did about it. And I think that's why we celebrate them. And we'll talk, I guess, further this evening about various forms of discrimination that are occurring right now. And even the struggle to provide equality can create an inherent opposite discrimination if people don't recognize that those who may disagree with new laws and new opportunities should not be subjugated the way those who suffered before do. There is something that all of us as human beings, with all of our advances in technology and science and development and language, have to learn about some of the basic elements of humanity. And it is conversations like this that I think are a prelude to the day when we'll reach that goal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Governor. We're going to have some Q&A after our next presentation. We'll give the audience a real opportunity to engage these experts and experienced guests in their field. In introducing our next guest, I'd like to give you a little bit of background of why she's a perfect choice for this conversation. I take you back 1 week, minding my own business. I believe it was Thursday, July 8th. Was it a Thursday? Could be. And a letter, excuse me, it was I think a Monday, Tuesday. And a letter was posted online to a newspaper that covers the Hudson Valley in upstate New York, Orange County, Ulster County. It's called The Record. Yes, I know we're being videotaped. It's called The Record. And this website that posted this letter, and I'm not going to demean this audience by reading the entire letter that was posted online for thousands to read, a purportedly reputable newspaper, periodical, with a very wide audience. It was right after the governor had vetoed the KJ bill, the Curious Joe bill upstate. And here's part of the letter. Come to your own conclusion. KJ is a grand scale of what we are all facing in Orange and Sullivan counties. One only has to look at Bloomingburg for further proof. These subsets of Hasidim are popping up all over our beautiful counties without regard to the obvious decimation of our communal lands. The Stevensville Hotel Daytop just never ends. What property will they accumulate to their end, which is, of course, tax exempt? Further, they claim that because never again, that they will repopulate the Hasidic community, we should continue to give them land and perpetuate their illegal dependence on New York State. I will skip some more objectionable parts and continue. They marry within the community to ensure pure children, but ends up with an inordinate number of mentally deficient children, and that necessitates an inordinate number of tax-free schools for the handicapped. Skipping again. Further, I have recently learned that since their marriages are not recognized by New York State and occur within the strict community, they have legal rights to welfare and Medicaid and food stamps, as each family is considered with an unwed mother of teenage years to begin having children throughout childbearing years into their 30s. Welfare fraud, to say the least, is a serious situation in this area. They're killing us. Kate Payne, White Lake. Why do I bring this up? Not so much because a newspaper editor fell asleep at the switch and didn't see it, hopefully, and posted it up. They, of course, after demands on social media to take it down, did, which is no small feat. Not every newspaper does, certainly. The apology from the editor was very benign. We didn't see it. We apologized for some objectionable content, or whatever the meek apology was. Objectionable content. What is much more bothersome is that the thousands of people who read this and the writer who wrote this believes that it's true. That's the problem. That's the crisis. Are we so far away from Selma? This was last week. I was reading a book that was recommended to me, and I urge all of you to read it. It's called The Unfinished Diary by Chaim Yitzchak Wohlgelenter. It's an unbelievable book that was written throughout World War II in a bunker or in a private area. He was able to document his horrific experiences throughout the war. And he writes the following. In Poland before World War II, in a Polish town that I can't pronounce, the Jewish residents were the majority. Quote, they realized that non-Jews would not stand a chance against Jewish candidates in the town council elections. Consequently, they passed legislation allowing the mayor and the most important officials to be appointed by the government, leaving elections for lower positions only. In this way, the Polish minority retained political control over the town. End quote. Does any of this sound familiar to you? Is history repeating itself? They didn't know what the word block vote meant back then. But today, block vote is a dirty word in Orange County, in Ramapo, in Rockland County. Block vote means Orthodox Jews. And they will do anything and everything they can to stop the block vote. Enter the Anti-Defamation League. Miss Deborah Lauder is a wonderful person to address us tonight. Why? She's Director of Civil Rights for the ADL, a position that she has held since 2006. She oversees a vast array of programs for the ADL, domestic policies, programming and staffs in 3 different departments: legal affairs, civil rights, litigation, extremism. She's in charge of the area that monitors hate and extremism. I'm sure that division is very busy. And the ADL really needs no introduction. But we must understand that discrimination is not reserved for one community. It is unfortunately a tremendous problem and a growing problem. It is discrimination in the African American community, the Hispanic minority community. See what's going on in the presidential elections and listen to the conversation. And of course, it is something that the Jewish community, and specifically the Hasidic Jewish community, is now suffering with. Ms. Lauder is a wonderful presenter, and I am very honored that she has joined us. Ms. Lauder.
Thank you. I think I'll stand so we have the bright light right in front of our face. So thank you, Haskell, and thank you, Ezra, and the Friedland Group. JP Updates, I'm getting them daily. I hope all of you are subscribers. It's a very helpful publication. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here and sharing the podium with the governor, a true hero of me personally and of the Jewish community. You've been such a great friend to ours, Governor. So I particularly enjoyed your opening remarks tonight. So I want to give a little context before we get into some of the issues about ADL. I know you all will know we are the leading civil rights organization in the Jewish community, but it's important to understand the context in which we were born, which was 1913. And it was at a time when Jews in America were starting to feel pretty comfortable here, right? And where you saw the anti-Semitism was in, clearly we didn't have television, so it was in newspapers and it was in plays when you saw stereotypical figures, demeaning figures of Jews. And the leaders of ADL were business people in Chicago, and they founded the organization as part of B'nai B'rith. We're no longer part of B'nai B'rith, but it was formed as a organization within it. And the mission statement back then, 102 years ago, was exactly the same as it is today. And it's very important to understand it. It was to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and secure justice and fair treatment for all, right? So it was this 2-part mission. One was going to be this particularist mission that we're there for the Jewish people, and the other was the universalist mission, that if we're going to be safe and secure in this country, we're going to work on behalf of all, and we're going to make sure that democratic values are safe and secure, because we knew from whence we came, right? So for all these 102 years, we have been engaged in both missions. When I speak in certain places, people, sometimes Jewish audiences, are, why are you getting involved in immigration rights for Hispanics? Or why are you working for voting rights for African Americans? We have always done that. We've been proud of our agenda. We think it's not only the right thing to do for its own sake, but because it ensures a democracy in which Jews are going to flourish and be safe and secure. So we're very proud of our robust agenda. When I was listening to the governor talk about Selma, it's very important for you to understand from what was happening at that point in time. He referenced how African Americans were treated. In Alabama, 50 years ago, when the Selma March took place, only 2% of African Americans were registered to vote. Selma was primarily about voting rights. And what had happened when African Americans were trying to register, a grandmother was being harassed by police officers. Her grandson, his name was Jimmy Lee Jackson, got up and tried to protect his grandmother from the abuse of law enforcement, and he was shot and killed. Right, so we look today and we see some of these incidents we're dealing with, whether it's Ferguson and what happened in Staten Island and the relationship between law enforcement and the communities they're sworn to protect. At that time, this mobilized the country, and the walk in Selma did mobilize hundreds of people to walk, Jews included. It was primarily African Americans, but there were rabbis. I've looked at our archives. ADL President Abe Foxman's predecessor, Ben Epstein, was part of the march. A number of rabbis, the most famous being Abraham Joshua Heschel. We also found, and I had not heard this all these years, the rabbis were wearing their kippot, and African Americans said, "What is that? What is that on your head?" And they explained that we don it in reverence to God. And so the African American marchers ordered 500 kippot so that they could also march later in the week with their God hats, which was really a lovely thing. So sometimes when you see pictures, you might be able to pick it out. So over these years, when you look at when you hit an anniversary like last year, the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of '64. This year, the Selma anniversary, August 7th, will be the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. Last year, we had the 60th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education. So it gives you those occasions to say, are we there yet? How far have we come? Are we at the Sabbath, for me, the perfection of our democratic society? And I think we all have to say no, we're just not there yet. We have made incredible advances. There's just no doubt about it. But we have a long way to go. So for those of you, I don't know how many attorneys are here in the audience, but voting rights today are a serious problem. I would have thought that would have been taken care of, but a couple years ago, the Supreme Court ruled in a case. They removed what we call pre-clearance provisions from certain states that had a history of discrimination. And the minute they did that, a number of states put in restrictive voting requirements. And you might have seen the papers this week. North Carolina's case is being litigated as right now because they did some measures that we agree with the plaintiffs in that case, that cut back were intentionally put in to cut back on minority voting. So voting rights is still a big issue. I mentioned Brown versus Board of Education, the case which was going to say we can't have separate but equal education. If you look at our public schools today, they are not, many of them are completely segregated, and they are definitely not equal. We have a major problem in our public education systems today with what's happening. We have mass incarceration problems. The number of African Americans who are incarcerated in this country is unconscionable. And so these civil rights issues are ongoing. And as we've heard, and I think Haskell said it so passionately and beautifully, this is a democracy, and it takes people to stand up and to be part of the democracy. It's not easy. It takes a lot of patience and passion. We don't all agree on issues, and I'm sure we're going to discuss some tonight where we have very divergent views, but that's what democracy is about. I think what has pained me and a number of my colleagues, and Abe Foxman, as you know, is actually retiring next week after 50 years with the Anti-Defamation League. I think when we talk about some of the challenges we're seeing is the lack of civility in the discussions we're having. We are going to have differences. We are going to have differences in approach, in laws, but there has been, I think I've been a Jewish professional for now over 20 years. I started in the federation system. And the way that people talk to each other and demean each other it's upsetting. And so for me to be invited to this kind of forum in which we can have the dialogue, air the differences, talk about issues in a civil way is really a gift. And so I'm grateful to be here, and I hope we can get at some of the issues that are on your mind, because there are a lot of them going on. I want to comment on the letter that Haskell read. At the ADL, you heard I oversee the Center on Extremism. I see this stuff all the time, and I'm pretty, I wouldn't say inured to it. This one actually did shock me for a number of reasons, but partly because that woman actually put her name on that, right? A lot of the hate we see today that flows on the internet, and it's a major priority of the Anti-Defamation League, is because it's anonymous. People feel empowered that they can just spew their, whether it's anti-Semitism or racism or homophobia, it's just out there. And so that she put her name on this was just like, really? You're actually brave enough to do that? The way ADL measures anti-Semitism is kind of twofold. One is through attitudinal surveys, right? So when we try to see, is it worse when we say, are we, how bad are things? Attitudes in the United States have anti-Semitic attitudes have drastically fallen. When we started doing these surveys decades ago, maybe half of the American population expressed what we would call firmly anti-Semitic views. We have a whole list of criteria that were created by professors at UC Berkeley. Today, our surveys show about 10%. 10% of Americans hold firmly anti-Semitic views. So we have a clear example of one here. So we're talking about, 35 million people or so. I think it also represents probably the percentage of Americans who are just bigots generally as well. That's just my take on it. We can say there's always going to be bigots, and you have the right to be a bigot in this country. It's one of those First Amendment principles we will stand up for, but there's consequences to that bigotry, and we always look for, are people going to stand up? So as horrific as Charleston was, and as it's just, nobody can deny what a horrific act of a white supremacist targeting African Americans in prayer. What's been unbelievable is the way this country has rallied around that community. And that's what you expect in a civil democracy. And that's what we expect when all these kinds of community tension issues arise, is where is civil society and where's the mainstream reaction to it? So whether it's discrimination against the groups that Haskell mentioned, whether it's church-state issues, we're always look for people of goodwill to stand up and try to be part of the democratic process. Thank you.
We're going to open up the floor to conversation. Is there another mic that can go around, or this is the mic that's going to go around? You have one there? To kick off the first question, I'd like to ask Mark Appel of the Bridge to warm us up with a question or a comment.
So first I want to thank JP Updates, Joe Gross and Jacob Kornbluth, and all, of course, Haskell, and all the distinguished panelists, Governor Patterson, ADL. I have a close working relationship with Evan. It's wonderful to be here, and I think this venue is the first of its kind where we're reaching out to trying to bridge the gap between the communities and restoring that historic relationship that all our communities always had. And the question that I have, why in the year 2015, when we have so many wonderful community advocates, we have the Anti-Defamation League, which does a wonderful work. We have JP Updates, American Jewish Congress, Jewish Community Relations Council. Why has 2015 been such a bleak year in the United States of America? So much violence, so much tearing apart. We're living in an era where we are educated. And we are the most educated generation in the history of the United States. Yet, tensions are so thick in America. We have to work together with the communities that we worked with 50 years ago. We can be a proud supporter, and we're fighting hard for tax credits for yeshivas, but we can also be a proud supporter of our public school. These two things don't contradict. And the community, both sides, people in New York City have to understand that we are strong supporters for tax credits for our yeshivas, but we are also supporting public school education, because if public education is down, then we suffer and the entire community suffer. We can be strong supporters, and we are strong supporters, of New York City bravest men, New York City Police Department, but we also support
Okay. Governor, you want to respond? Response, Governor?
This is a very difficult economy that we still live in. The measurable improvement has not seeped down to the lower levels of society, where the unemployment rate is still high, where people are working 2 and 3 jobs. And at times like that, situations that would impress upon a community that there was an injustice have graduated into violence. We saw that in Baltimore, Maryland. We saw it last year in Ferguson, Missouri. But interestingly enough, we did not see that in New York City. And the reason I think that we did not, where we would have 50 years ago, because there was some celebrated riots in Harlem 51 years ago in 1964 after the shooting of a young man named James Powell, who was running from a policeman and was shot in the back there, is because when people feel that government is working, they are far less interested in becoming violent or taking matters into their own hands. So I think that in that respect, after there have been a few shootings in New York, the shooting of a gentleman named Gurley in the Pink Houses and the death of Eric Garner, what you saw were peaceful protests. You saw a lot more younger people getting involved. But you did see the semblance of an understanding that law enforcement, government, and a jurisprudence system, a criminal justice system, can actually discharge these problems. And to further it, the governor has decided in the last week to have the Attorney General look at cases of unarmed civilians being shot, not because the district attorneys don't do a good job, but because there's a perceived relationship, because there is a relationship. I worked in the DA's office. There is a relationship between ourselves and the police when working in that capacity, but that the Attorney General's office has some distance, and that may provide the public with an understanding that a fairer conclusion will be reached, even if it's the same conclusion in a lot of cases that was reached before, but it will remove the perception of a relationship that could hurt the process.
So I'd also like to respond. Well, we're in July, so the year's not over yet, so I'm not sure I'm willing to say this has been the bleakest year. God willing, no more incidents will happen. I want to harken back to what I said before. Some of the breakdown in civility, I think, actually has to do with the way we process our news. There's so many choices today, and you can really decide what view you want to have. Sometimes when I'm speaking to an audience and I have no idea where they are, I was a rhetoric major in college, and they would always say, know who your audience is. And so I could just say, how many of you are going home tonight and watching Fox? And how many of you are going to go home and watch CNN? And I would pretty much know who I'm speaking to, right? So people are channeling their thoughts. So that's one thing that I think does influence the polarization. I want to comment on the law enforcement, because I did reference the relationship between law enforcement and the communities they serve. This might surprise, Haskell in his introduction said I oversee ADL's Center on Extremism. This is kind of the area of our work that most people don't know we do. We actually started monitoring hate and extremist individuals back in 20s. We were the ones that sort of unmasked the Klan. And we have a very robust program of doing this. We have what's considered investigative reporter status. So we can keep an eye on the bad guys, and we can share that information with law enforcement. So for example, when the shooting happened in Charleston, one of the first calls the police would make was to my staff, and they'd say, do you know this guy? And we were able to identify the jacket he was wearing, had the African flag, no, not the Confederate flag, it was an African flag, a South African flag that was an Afrikaner symbol of, and we knew immediately he was a white extremist. ADL today is the leading non-government organization training law enforcement in this country on hate and extremism. One of the programs we also do is we take law enforcement through the U.S. Holocaust Museum, and we talk to them about what happened during Nazi Germany times, when police who were sworn to protect ended up becoming part of the problem. And it's a very value-based program, and it makes them really look at stereotypes they have of the people they serve and the stereotypes that people have of cops, right? It's very impactful. We've trained over 100,000 members of law enforcement. Every FBI analyst is required to go through our training. And I will tell you that post-Ferguson and these other incidents, the number of calls I'm getting from police around the country is skyrocketing. They're saying, we could be the next one. Help us, we need anti-bias training and value-based training. So in that way, I'm an optimist. The police that we deal with are really of goodwill. They want to make a difference. They want to be part of the solution and be part of serving a community. Are there some systemic problems? Yes, we are seeing them. Do we have the will to address them? I believe we do, and that is where I find the optimism. FBI Director Comey gave a really beautiful speech following Ferguson, and he talked about implicit bias. All of us have implicit bias, and I think the Jewish community is on the end of people's prejudices, oftentimes because, particularly in the Orthodox community, when you're visibly Jewish, you can be the target of implicit bias in a very profound way, and Haskell referred to some of that. But all people have them. It's how you handle them, how you end up respecting differences, not just tolerating the other, but actually respecting those differences and making it work, making living together work. So when we talk about our work from a civil rights perspective, we also at ADL look at things from a community relations perspective. This is not easy business, and sometimes those things are different, but sometimes they always need to work together. So I tend to be on the optimist side. I don't want to say this is the bleakest year we've ever seen. There have been incidents, but again, I'm buoyed by the fact that good people have stood up to the hate.
Yerucham Silber, Executive Director of the Borough Park Jewish Community Council.
Thank you. And before I begin, I want to again thank JP Updates. I believe this is the third forum I've been at in this particular venue over the last few months. I must say, each one has been more enlightening and informative than the previous one. And keep it up. This is a wonderful discussion forum and a really wonderful group to be together in the discussion. And to my good friend Chasko Bennett, you set the bar very high for moderators. So great job. I want to really talk on civil rights. It wasn't brought up in the presentations, but really, I guess, the kind of next avenue, the most latest venue for civil rights, and that is, as far as civil rights for the LGBT community. And especially in light of the recent Supreme Court decision, legalizing or preventing laws against gay marriage. Now, I think most of us, if I speak for most of us in the Orthodox community, certainly for myself and for others, we don't look to discriminate. We respect the dignity and of each person, no matter what they're choosing, what their orientation is, or what their race is, or whatever. And we certainly don't condone any discrimination against LGBT people when it comes to things like housing and employment and things like that. It does cross a line. I shouldn't. When the question comes in when it comes up against our religious values, of the Orthodox Jewish religious values that defines marriage, traditional marriage, man and a woman. How do we, and I guess I address this question both to Governor Patterson and to Ms. Lauder, how do we kind of draw that balance on the one hand to, it's gotten to the point actually where we feel we cling to our religious values, we almost feel like we're looked at as certain quarters as homophobic, which we're certainly not. And I certainly don't believe any of us feel that way. How do we strike that balance between non-discrimination in areas that I mentioned, housing, employment, other things like that, and keeping to our line of traditional marriage, and specifically in the case of, for example, a catering hall, a band leader, a photographer, people who are in the business of serving at weddings, and the possibility of being sued for refusing to perform their services at a LGBT wedding. I know this was brought up, I believe, by Justice Alito in both in oral arguments and his dissent. He brought this topic up, and Justice Kennedy, in his opinion, alluded to it and said their religious rights would be protected, but there was nothing written in the decision that would protect those from exercising their religious rights. So I'd like to hear from the panelists, how do you strike that balance between non-discrimination yet protecting certain religious rights? Thank you.
Governor Patterson.
So I had been a supporter of marriage equality in New York State, and on May 14th, 2008, I signed a bill recognizing the marriages because same-sex marriage was not legal in New York State in 2008, but I recognized the marriages in the 5 states that already had it, using the full faith and credit clause of the Constitution to do so. My popularity in the black community when I became governor was 91%. And by the beginning of 2009, my popularity in the black community had dropped to 54% because there has been a resistance to marriage equality, such as there might be right here. So what I did to try to appease members of my own community was I held meetings with a number of ministers in the executive mansion around the state. And interestingly enough, what the ministers said really shocked me. For the most part, they said, we know that no matter how much we protest this is going to become the law of the land. I said, I'm not so sure. They said, we are very sure. It'll be the law of the land within the next few years. They turned out to be right. They said, but our concern is whether or not we can practice our religions and whether or not we will be in danger. And a scenario that was cited to me is a same-sex couple is going to get married. They have an event for them at the job, like a little party, or one of them is getting married, and they have a little party among the co-workers. And a person that doesn't believe that this is God's will, does not want to attend the party, says, look, I wish them well, but I can't be part of the celebration. Is that person going to be ostracized at work? And I must say that whenever the majority of people, no matter what the issue is, have a point of view, and someone is now seen as either not in the majority or not what's in vogue right now, there is an ostracization and, in many sense, a degrading of people and a feeling that they are, as was just said, homophobic or have some kind of hatred when they're really just practicing the tenets of their religion. So I made a point in advocating for same-sex marriage after those meetings of pointing out that should the law ever change, we don't want to replace a set of oppressed people with a new set of oppressed people, because that's not what America is supposed to be about. Now, there are some legal distinctions between public facilities and private ones, and some of that has to be worked out. But if that's the guiding principle, I think some of the anxiety that's justifiably felt by a lot of you in this room will go away. If we just say it's great that we have same-sex marriage, and now anybody who even voices an opinion to the opposite is shouted down and cajoled, then we've learned nothing from the process of trying to give people who would like to engage in the contract of marriage. We've learned nothing in that process.
Governor, a wonderful answer, and very much appreciated. And I would, before I give Ms. Lauder an opportunity to respond, I'd like to just add on to Yerucham's 1,000-pound gorilla question in the room. I'm sure all of us read who's coming here and immediately thought, well, how is this relevant? And you didn't have to think that hard. I make this case to many public officials, certainly of the liberal persuasion in New York City. We're living today where the capital of progressive politics is New York City. The mayor makes no bones about it. He's thrilled to pieces and he waves the flag of progressive politics, as does the city council. We hear about civil rights. We hear about women's rights. We hear a lot about equal rights. In New York City, we hear all the time about animal rights. Somehow lost in the conversation, somehow something lost in the rights conversation is the religious rights. And that is deeply unfortunate. This country has been nothing but tremendous. We call it the Golden Medina, the golden country. No country in the history of the world probably was more welcoming and more beneficial to the growth of the Jewish religion and Orthodox Jewish religion. So yes, Yerucham, it's not just to be branded a bigot or homophobic. What about the tax-exempt status of organizations, yeshivas, shuls? It's a real problem. It's a real concern brought up by the Supreme Court. What about school curriculum for yeshivas? How far does society go to encroach upon the Jewish community and the religious Jewish community? Yes, it is a clear and present danger to religious orthodoxy in America. And I am proud to say that the only Jewish organization that made a contribution in the form of an amicus brief to the Supreme Court opposing that law was Agudath Israel of America, not for homophobic reasons, and not to push our definition of how we feel the world should be, but because of these very, very legitimate concerns that concern anyone who has a fidelity to religion. Ms. Lauder.
Thank you. So ADL has been consistently a strong supporter both of church-state separation, religion-state separation, and of same-sex marriage in the United States. We did file a brief not only in the Obergefell case that went to the Supreme Court, but in most of the same-sex marriage cases. I think I think the concern in the community is justified. I think there is some misunderstanding. Nothing in this law, the new Supreme Court ruling, will require clergy to perform same-sex marriages. If you're a private institution, you can have your religious values and act out on them. Where we're going to see the rubber hit the road is, in fact, in the institutions which are already public, right? So if you're serving, so if you come to this restaurant, this is a public restaurant, you should not have the right to discriminate. The real challenge is going to be in those areas that we call religiously affiliated, right? So Yeshiva University, if they have their dorms and they open up to married couples, can they exclude same-sex couples? That's the kind of issue we're going to have to litigate along the road. ADL's position has consistently been that you have the right to have your religious freedom, but not when it ends up discriminating against somebody else. That's just not what we believe America has been about. I looked at the first case ADL filed as a civil rights organization. It was the Shelley versus Kramer case. That was the case that said, in the Supreme Court, that said you can't put restrictive covenants in when you're selling your home. You can't say, I'm not selling to Jews or blacks. So when we began this discussion, we talked about the principles that have served us well, served us as Jews well. Those are the same kind of principles we believe should be applied to all, that you just can't impose your own religious belief if it results in discrimination against somebody else. It's a very difficult issue. We're going to have to take a lot of these things case by case. I agree with the questioner when he opened up saying the threat he feels for those who feel that people are doing this from a place of homophobia. I think I've seen it. I think that's right. But overall, I have been, when we talk about is this a dismal year, for us it's been a really incredible year. We just did a Supreme Court roundup, and we filed in 7 cases in the Supreme Court, and ADL was succeeded in 5 of them. And for us, this was a year of where the court stood up for religious freedom. They stood up for a Muslim's right to sport his beard, and I think Gudas, joined us in the brief on that one. That stood up for the right of this woman who had gone to Abercrombie & Fitch. She had her headscarf, and Abercrombie didn't hire her, and the court said, that was not right. That was a real victory for Jews as well. We all stood up for religious freedom in this country. So this is the play between these two concepts is going to be difficult. It's what I was alluding to in terms of we have to have these debates in a civil way. But ADL's position is strongly going to be going forward that we are going to act for non-discrimination. Today in this country, there are 29 states in which you can be fired for no other reason than you're gay. In our book, that's totally unacceptable, and we're going to be doing more work to protect gay rights. So that's what we believe America is about, and we're proud of that work.
My colleague Leon Goldenberg.
First, I want to thank JP Updates. It is the 3rd one that I've been at, and I think it's very informative. And of course, Ezra Friedlander from the Friedlander Group, and my partner in many issues, Haskell, who is, as Yerucham said, a #1 moderator and really raises the bar. I'd like to first say something to the governor, which is really a little bit off topic here, but Governor Cuomo has said how he has made on-time budgets. Governor Patterson didn't, but what Governor Patterson did do is when he wasn't getting on-time budgets, he used that budget extenders to actually cut the budget of a lot of fat. So I want to thank him for that. I'll just a little bit further on the topic that was just raised. The issue really is when our yeshivas teach Torah and they teach Leviticus, they can be accused of discrimination. They can be challenged in court. We're not there yet, but we're very close. And they can be challenged, and they could face losing the 501(c) status. And that is a real possibility, and that will destroy our community. It will destroy the yeshiva movement, and it's something that I understand the ADL may be on the other side, but I think you also have to look at religious communities that do have rights. We do not discriminate individually. I don't think so. I know I don't. I'm in housing. I've never discriminated on any, whether it's LGBT or if it's race or color. But on a personal level, when it comes into the yeshiva, when it comes into shul, and in the shul, if the rabbi is speaking on the parsha of the week and the topic is there, so now I think you'll find that rabbis will stay away from it, but if somebody does mention it, the entire structure of the shul will lose its 501(c). Another issue which is very important, the attacks that was raised earlier, the attacks on KJ, the attacks in Bloomingburg, East Ramapo, doesn't mean that we're in a perfect world because we're Orthodox. Everything that we do is perfect. There's no question that mistakes are made. Some mistakes were made in East Ramapo. But at the end of the day, a lot of what you see, and Chaim David Zwiebel went to speak at a hearing on the bill that did pass the Assembly and the Senate on KJ, and he sat there waiting for his turn. He says the hatred that was spewed from the audience, and it was clear to him that it was purely anti-Semitic, anti-Hasidic, and I think it's something that we need the governor to speak up on and the ADL to really come out forceful in many of these issues and call it for what it is, anti-Semitism and racism. It is not about, we have a nice little town in Bloomingburg of 150 people, and we don't want it to expand with 400 housing units. They were fine when it was expanding with 100 housing units, which if it would have been an idyllic American couple would have been 2.5. That still would have brought 250 people into a community of 150. So again, it's just, at the end of the day, it's pure and simple anti-Semitism, more anti-Orthodoxy than general anti-Semitism.
Governor.
I just want to comment on the not-for-profit status of religious schools. One of the reasons that there is a separation from church and state is we mostly talk about the separation from the public side, separation of church and state. But the other part of the separation is that the religious values and religious teachings should not be invaded by the public unless it comes into the public domain. And the not-for-profit status, though it is conferred publicly, is really to protect the sovereignty of not-for-profit organizations as long as they adhere to the regulations of not-for-profit status. In my view, they do not include what you believe, what you teach. They would include any action, let's say, to try to stop others from exercising their freedom. But again, I'm going to repeat this. If we get to the point where we have now replaced a class of people such as gay and lesbian citizens who have been historically discriminated against and oppressed with a new oppression based on religion, then we have not gone anywhere as a society in terms of learning the values of respect for other people's feelings and their beliefs.
Menachem Lubensky.
First, I wanted to thank the organizers of this event, not only because they raise extremely important issues, but they give us an opportunity sometimes to put our foot on the brake and to think about where we are and where we need to go. And sometimes we just don't, in this rat race world, we just don't have the luxury of doing that. My wife and I, Ezra and his wife, Larry Gordon and his wife, just came back from an emotional 5-day trip to Poland, visiting the Auschwitz, Birkenau, and all Majdanek and all the horrors that every Jewish person in the world knows about. I also just wrote extensively about 70 years after the liberation, but one of the things that people don't recognize is that enormous decision that those survivors had to make where they were going to live. Homeless, penniless, skeletal remnants of the Holocaust. And do you know that many of them, and this is interesting, they came to America because they saw in America the opposite of the horrors that they experienced in Eastern Europe. They came here because they wanted to leave those horrors behind, and the new world of America, here was a currency that said, "In God we trust." Here were the Judeo-Christian values. Here was a society that was tolerant. Now, I've also had the benefit of, I'm 45 years in this business, as they say, having worked with the best, Rabbi Moshe Shero of blessed memory, and experiencing his view on this whole entire subject. We're one of the only groups that when we defend ourselves, we first have to write 20 pages of who we are. When I speak to groups of supermarket executives, because they're interested in the big kosher market, and I tell them, you know, we have 52 holidays before we have our first holiday, and they look at me like I just fell off Mars. One of the biggest problems that I've seen in 45 years is ignorance. The blood libel today takes many different forms, but it is a blood libel nonetheless. The Erev is a string upon which they hang who knows what. The mikveh is something that they do that is crazy. The yarmulke that they wear is archaic. The popular culture certainly is the opposite of exactly everything that we stand for. The media is our biggest enemy because the media, in its usual man bites dog, picks the worst of who we are, not the best of who we are. So put that together, it becomes an almost lethal nuclear combination that every Orthodox Jew and every Hasidic Jew must face. I was asked at an airport in Portland, Maine, what is it that you have on your back, those strings? What is it connected to? Well, that happens to be the phylacteries, the tzitzis that I wear. Now, if America cannot take the time to learn about cultures, it cannot take the time to learn about tolerance, it doesn't understand civil rights, it'll never get it right. And this, to me, is the priority. And this is what I learned from Rabbi Shero. And Rabbi Shero often said to me many, many times, I need to take 20 minutes before I start my testimony to say who I am. Who else gets up in front of the Congress and has to say, by the way, you know, I am an Orthodox Jew, we believe in the commandments of Sinai. I have to go through my entire presentation of who I am because you don't want to take the time to understand who I am. You don't care to know, or you believe the blood libel or the modern day blood libel. This is something that I don't believe that we're unique in that. I believe other cultures also have that same issue. But we face it every single day because the visible, the visuals that they see are so far from the popular culture that it raises so many different questions. Why can't you take a cab on the Sabbath? Well, do you know what the Sabbath is? Do you know why Jews celebrate the Sabbath? Absolutely not. So what I'm suggesting is, if we have a role, it is to step up the fact of a presentation of who we are. Then you'll understand what our rights are. Our rights are that we came to this country to be able to thrive in a society that is tolerant. That is the key word. If it is not a society that is tolerant, that's not the society that we bought into. Thank you.
Ms. Louder.
So I totally agree that we haven't really talked about the proactive, and that's the word education. The example you gave is a really good one, and we get these kinds of calls often. People see us as the 911. If something happens, call the ADL, and they'll often say, I just had an anti-Semitic incident. That kind of example is a perfect example of ignorance, not anti-Semitism. So it does require. Now, we are only, less than 2% of this country. I think you can't expect people to know about us. In my experience and at ADL, and I think most educators would say this, for the most part, when we try to educate in those circumstances, people are of goodwill. They really want to know. We do experience the opposite occasionally, but it's the minority of incidents. So we are in schools. ADL runs the leading anti-bias training programs in the country today. We've impacted over 60 million students, both in public and private schools. And we actually don't use the word tolerance. We actually prefer using the word respect. Respect for differences. Don't tolerate the other, but actually respect their differences. And we can't, nobody's born hating, right? Hate is learned, and it can be unlearned. And the work we do in these schools shows that. I mean, we have really, I think, made a demonstrable impact. In those schools that we talk about holidays, we can talk about celebrate the differences. We do make an impact. And I think it's important that it's a constant, it is a burden on us if you look at it that way, but I think that's just one of the things we have to do. We have to sort of cavil in our difference and be willing to share with people that we're proud of who we are and stand up for our rights to express our religious views. Thank you.
Before I call on Attorney Sanford Rubenstein, talking about intolerance and talking about ignorance, approximately a year and a half ago, you all will remember the New York Post front cover of a Hasidic landlord who had been murdered by the name of Stark. And the picture was the Hasidic man in his shtreimel, probably from a wedding, wearing his Shabbos best. Who wouldn't want him dead, was the caption. And it outraged and energized the community. Well, I have to tell you the other side of the conversation, because after 3 or 4 days of endless attacks against the New York Post by thousands of Orthodox Jews who were simply blown away by the insensitivity of the crime, I joined a delegation of 3 other much more impressive people than me, lawyers and rabbis, a delegation of 4, to the editor of the New York Post in Manhattan. First question, I don't get it. We're so good to you. Who's better to Israel than the New York Post? We're the only conservative newspaper in town. What did we do wrong? After showing and discussing Hasidic slumlord and explaining the connotation of what you're trying to say, and after an hour, there was a realization, we blew it. They got it. But it took us to figure out a way to get to them. They should meet with us and listen, actually be willing to listen. Sanford Rubenstein.
Thank you. I'd like to take one of the points that the governor made regarding the recent executive order of the governor, Governor Cuomo, to appoint the Attorney General as the investigator and prosecutor in cases of police killings. First of all, let me remind you, it doesn't just affect the African American community. I've represented Abdul Wima, the family of Sean Bell. I was in the Garner case doing litigation with it, and most recently the Gurley case. But there also was a young Hasidic man who was mentally unstable about 10, 15 years ago who was killed here in Brooklyn. Why is this appointment of the Attorney General such a good thing? First of all, those of us in the civil rights movement have been asking for either an independent prosecutor or the Attorney General for many, many years, ever since the Diallo killing. But the truth of the matter is, I was in the office of a prosecutor who will remain nameless, and it was a major high-profile case. And the prosecutor said to me, I know that when I prosecute these police officers, when I need police officers as witnesses in my cases, they're not going to be so friendly. But don't worry about it. It's not going to affect me. The fact that he had to even say that showed you that there was a problem. And I applaud the governor, because it doesn't just affect the African American community, it affects all of us on the issue of police brutality. And one other point on that I think is significant, and that is, many times we see that a case is not proceeded with by the local district attorney. The federal government has jurisdiction, and in the Abdul Wima case, they took that jurisdiction. In the Sean Bell case, they did not. And many other cases, they did not, because you have to prove intent. Intent is not easy to prove. Whereas in the state system, all you need is reckless conduct. And I believe the federal statutes in civil rights have to be amended to allow the federal government to come in and prosecute where there is a reckless killing. So I think that's the next step that we need.
Yaakov Hirsch, board member of the Kleinman Holocaust Education Center. Come forward.
I want to echo first the sentiments of all the previous speakers and thank the Friedlander Group and Jewish Political Updates, because I think these kinds of interactions can be very meaningful. And hopefully some of the comments that are shared here will find their way into the print media or other media so they can be used as a basis for further discussions by others outside of the room. You know, we in our tradition as Orthodox Jews believe that every person in society, every person in the world is created and is placed here with a specific mission. And the mission of each individual cannot be accomplished by anybody else. And that leads us to a profound understanding that every individual is unique. And unique but equal is not the same as separate but equal. And echoing the comments that were made here, a large remedy for the issues that we're touching upon here tonight is related to the ability to successfully educate the new generations based on our experience. One of the topics that was mentioned, of course, that was a basis for a lot of initiatives that were presented and that are reflected in the development of the Jewish community, both in America and throughout the world, is the events that occurred relating to the Holocaust. And in our project, the Kleinman Holocaust Education Center, we're committed to establishing an environment where Jewish children, students, and public school students, non-Jewish students, can come and learn the experience of what can happen in a society where the rule of law is not respected and where people in a society are able to show respect to each other. The idea of educating and sensitizing youth to these values is not limited just to our own community, but it's something which is a universal theme. And we hope to be able to be part of the process that will address some of the issues that were raised tonight. Thank you.
Mr. Moskowitz.
I would like to make a statement first. Most of my so-called public service is more on international scene than local scene. I would like to say two things that you should understand. In the middle of the 80s, 85, we were fighting that the Orthodox Jewry or Hasidic Jews should be accepted as minorities, and it happened. Okay, I was part of that process. There was a convention in Javits Center. You had every large corporations where they had to have a set aside of 15% of their procurement set aside for minorities. So here I am going. I don't want to say exactly the name of the company, but there is only 3 automotive companies, and one of them calls me over, says, "Look, you're very ugly, but you know what? I rather do business with you with all than with the rest of them. I never ever will go and try to get a set-aside program as a minority, just not to take away from those people who are fighting so much and they initiated this whole thing." That is one issue. I had a second incident where in Giuliani's times, he decided that since we have a sister city program with South Africa, that a delegation should go down and take a look exactly what kind of business could be drummed up for New York companies. Rudy Washington was the head of the delegation. He was a deputy mayor, and he told Giuliani, look, I need to have one guy, one white guy, but my type of white guy, I want David. And he wanted to make sure that the South Africans are not going to look at 13 people of who has one white guy and one guy with a beard, a white guy, but they wanted to leave a certain understanding that all of us in New York who have a sister city program, we are all, this is what we are, this is how we're going to be doing business. The point is, everything went beautiful except in the last day, which could not happen in New York. In the city hall, we have a meeting. We have about 28 people, and they give us the whole thing with whom we met and everything else. And we would like to know what's in it for us. Okay, so who are you? Well, we are the spokesman of the people. Okay, so I kind of got the message very fast. So I asked him, so what are you looking for? Well, 70-30, 60-40 or something of that sort. So I asked them, I don't understand. You're talking about you want to have the investment 70%, you want to have the losses of 70%. We came over here as an agency to help you out, to build. I met with Mandela, everything was fine. So how could this thing happen? So this is what I'm trying to tell you, that there is bigotry not in United States. Haskell started up the conversation reading an email, okay, or an email, whatever it was. If in the U.S. News and World Report of this week, you have somehow they're trying to struggle that to understand how could have the incident that happened in the Supreme Court, how did that come about? It is not actually just the law itself, which you could play around with it, but the sentiment of the populace was taken into effect. Therefore, the Supreme Court had looked more into the sentiment of society than the law of society. My question is, Abe Foxman, we are good buddies and we'll be good buddies too. We have lots of things together and we go to international conferences. My question is this thing what is happening, and you said some statistics which somehow did not, I don't understand it. Do you think that the type of language that is being used lately in the last year is happening because of the international situation as it goes on in the world, and they're using certain language that we never heard? I'm here, I was sold into freedom in 1962, and I never seen anything of that sort. So that is my question. So if I may, I would like to ask the government and yourself whether you would be able to comment on it. Obviously, it's your making.
We're going to hold the question, and we're going to give the governor and Ms. Lauder an opportunity right after the last question to respond to your question and to make a closing statement. I'd like to ask the chairman of the Flatbush Jewish Community Coalition, my colleague Josh Melman, to ask a brief question. This will be the last question of the evening.
Thank you. Thank you for JP Updates. Appreciate the beautiful forum. Thank you to the panelists and, of course, my dear friend and co-founder of our FJCC Flatbush Coalition, Haskell Bennett, for your wonderful production here this evening. Twofold brief question. Number one is, on a practical level, how do leaders in our communities of synagogues and yeshivas deal with anti-Semitism on a practical level? And number two, I'll address Mr. Joe Gross. How does your beautiful JP Updates informational political forum differ from other news sources? Thank you.
Okay, so let's give the governor a chance to respond, and then Ms. Lauder, and then we'll give Joe the bracha achrit at the last word. Governor Patterson.
Well, certainly leaders in any community have to often address the issue of discrimination against members of the community. And in those situations, what I recommend is, first of all, you can't pretend it's not happening. You can't try to explain the ignorance of those who are treating people in that way. You have to give people an opportunity to foment their anger at not being treated and, as Devorah said before, respected as human beings. That has to happen. At the same time, what we found is that the art of leading and defending also involves a humanitarian understanding that that hatred doesn't just exist everywhere else, that it sometimes can come from within, and therefore, rather than promoting oneself at the expense of others as a leader of anti-Semitism or anti-anything else, without recognizing that we have all kinds of discrimination in the world, I think sets the great leaders from the good ones. So, and I think we've seen that with the greatest of leaders, who we celebrate very often.
Thank you, Governor. Ms. Lauder.
Thank you. So I was intrigued by your question about what's happening worldwide. The example here I don't think was impacted by worldwide events, but the anti-Semitism that we do see expressed and where we do see a rise is connected with Israel. There's just no doubt about that. And some of the issues we're dealing with on some of the campuses and whatnot, where the line of criticism against Israel has morphed into anti-Semitism. I mentioned the statistic about 10% of Americans hold firmly anti-Semitic views. It's much higher. If you haven't seen the Global 100 survey we did about a year ago, it's really worth looking at on our website. You can go country by country. And depending on where you are in Middle East, North Africa, or Eastern Europe, the numbers are quite high. In some of the European countries, 20, 30% hold firmly anti-Semitic views. But what the good news is precisely the point the governor just made, is when people stand up, whether in the Holocaust, Jews lived. When elected officials stand up today, Jews are doing better. So on the aftermath of the horrendous anti-Semitic incidents in France, French government officials have been very forceful in decrying anti-Semitism, and we just recently released an update of that Global 100 poll, and in fact, anti-Semitic attitudes in France came down over the past year. So it's a key thing that we always look for, whether it's a local incident here in New York City. If there's an anti-Semitic incident, the first thing you want is to make sure law enforcement's responding and elected officials are speaking up against it. If an anti-Semitic, the question about, what should synagogue and other leaders do, you always must confront it. We have never believed in hiding it. You have to shine a light on it. You have to decry it. Otherwise, it will advance. So my message to you tonight is we all have, people of goodwill all have to stand up and say no, whether it's anti-Semitism, racism, homophobia, any kind of discrimination. We're all in this together, and I think in that we can find great pride in America. Thank you.
Mr. Gross.
By the way, great question, Josh. And the answer to that is, and basically the conversation tonight was, if I'm hearing it correctly, that we have seen a rise in anti-Semitism. We have seen the issue of anti-Semitic incidents crop up and be more in 2015 maybe than before. But the real issue is, and I think that's why we're seeing it so much, is the social media and the internet. And one of the things today, and we saw it with the issue in Baltimore and all over wherever there's protests. Social media is an invitation to everyone out there that wants to do a protest for a cause, get people together. It's a very easy forum to do it. JP Updates, from the other end of the spectrum, has been a leading Jewish organization that is providing news and coverage. But the twist and the difference between JP Updates and the others is very simple. It's unopinionated. We have, in the Jewish community, if you want to talk about newspapers, news organizations, we have the left and we have the right, maybe a center if you can find one. JP Updates does not take right or left sides. What they do is they bring you the news as it happens, or they bring you the right and the left opinions and issues and lets the reader decide whatever they want to read or not read, or whatever they want to disagree or agree with. And that's the difference between JP Updates and some of the others. It's also there to compensate for the lack of the social media and internet that is available in the Jewish community to combat anti-Semitism. So if there is an incident in Ramapo, in Rockland County, in France, JP Updates will have it, and there will be an op-ed or there will be exposure on those that are trying to increase anti-Semitism. And that, I think, will conclude the forum, and that's what we came for. The only one thing I would add, which I would like for the ADL to do more, is I think we've seen a little bit of uptick in the Hasidic anti-Semitism, which mentioned before Blumenberg and the KJ annexation. And I think the ADL should take a better approach, a more visible approach in defending the Orthodox Hasidic Jewish community, and not just the Jewish community as a whole. Thank you.
Excellent. Joe, you literally took the words out of my mouth. I wanted to end with that really important thought to Ms. Lauder. It has been a privilege to moderate this night. I think all of us can agree that this was a extraordinarily high-level discussion with very impressive guests. On a personal note, Governor, I grew up, my grandfather, of blessed memory, was visually impaired. I never saw him stop. I never saw him let him get it down. He worked until he couldn't anymore. He went every day on the Amtrak from his home in Queens to Long Island. And he was the most impressive person that I had ever met. He never let anything in his life stop him from pursuing his dream. I think all of us share an admiration for you, for a person who has challenges and has clearly risen way above any challenge that life has thrown at you to the highest of your profession, and we all admire you. And Ms. Lauder, I have to admit something. Being an activist is lonely business. There are days and nights where you see things that boil your blood, and my blood boils. And we feel alone in the Orthodox Jewish community. And every now and then, and like Joe Gross said, we'd like it to be more now than then, but every now and then when we feel the most vulnerable and the most down for tremendous discrimination and problems that are coming at us from all sides, in gallops the ADL and stands up with us. You don't necessarily understand how much we need you and how much we appreciate you when you're there. Please be there more for us. Thank you so much. And that concludes our JP Updates Forum. I would personally like to thank Ezra Friedlander of the Friedlander Group for once again corralling me into this job, and JP Updates for allowing me the privilege of moderating. Have a wonderful night, everybody.